Welcome back to Separating the Smith from the Myth, the podcast where I dust off the corners of my childhood and hold them up to the light, hoping you'll laugh as hard as my brothers cringed 55 years later. I'm your host, Brian Smith, and today we're traveling back to the summer of 1970. Now I know what you're thinking, 1970, that's ancient history. And you're right. But stick with me because what I'm about to tell you is a masterclass in preteen deception, manipulation, and the kind of scheme that should have gotten me banned from family dinners. It didn't. It's a story about hunger, ambition, and how far a clever 12-year-old will go when his stomach is growling louder than his conscience. Let me paint you a picture of 1970. Radio waves are absolutely owned by the Beatles. Marvin Gaye's I Heard It Through the Grapevine is making people feel things they didn't know they could feel. Meanwhile, the Jackson 5 were everywhere with their song I Want You Back. The Carpenters are playing in every living room. And there's a little song you might have heard of called Let It Be by the Beatles. The movie theaters, Love Story is breaking hearts everywhere. MASH is in theaters showing that war is absurd and comedy lives in dark places. Tora, Tora, Tora is giving us spectacular battle sequences on massive screens. And George C. Scott was yelling about war and destiny. It was the golden age of cinema. Before special effects meant computers, they meant actual filming, stunts, and actual acting. Sports, the Kansas City Chiefs had just won the Super Bowl. The baseball season began, and young boys like my brother Jeff and I were dreaming of Little League glory, which, by the way, we did achieve our second title in 3 years. The Big Red Machine in Cincinnati, just down the road from our Midwestern home. And speaking of our home, let me tell you about Upper Sandusky, Ohio. It was exactly what a small-town America looked like before the world got complicated. We lived on a tree-lined street where every house looked like it had been plucked from a Norman Rockwell painting. Kitchen that smelled like home cooking. Our mom understood cooking. She'd spend her days creating roasts, casseroles, breads, pies. Our kitchen on South 8th Street was the heart of our home, the place where everything good happened. And in our house, there were 4 boys at that time. Now let me break down the Smith sibling dynasty for you, because you'll need to understand the hierarchy to understand why this story matters. There was me, the oldest. I was the trailblazer, the cautionary tale, the one who would scheme. Then Jeff, a year and a half younger, as bright as they come, but still in that phase where he believed his older brother, which, in retrospect, was his first major life mistake. Then came the twins, Rick and Randy, 3 years after Jeff. They were mirror images of each other, but destined for very different paths. Kyle, he was still a year away from being born. He'd only know these stories secondhand, passed down like family folklore, probably with increasing embellishments every time Jeff told it. Well, 4 boys in 4.5 years. In 1970, only 4 of us existed, and we were loud, growing, and always hungry. Dad was working at Marion Power Shovel in Marion, Ohio. That's an absolutely iconic company. He and Mom were in their late 30s, in their prime. Dad would leave early in the mornings and come home tired but satisfied. They were good parents. They raised 4 boys who eventually figured out that actions have consequences. I spent my days like every other boy in America in 1970. I remember riding my bicycle on my paper route, folding my papers and throwing them with precision on someone's porch. And I followed sports obsessively, the way preteen boys do when sports are their entire universe. And I was growing, which means I was hungry constantly. My brothers, and I mean this with zero exaggeration, they still talk about how I would eat cereal. Not a bowl of cereal, one of Mom's enormous mixing bowls. I'd sit there growing like a weed, consuming a volume of food that defiled physics and economics. But on this particular summer day in 1970, there was a problem. Mom wasn't home. The critical details, as I remember from 55 years ago, this is where the story pivots from 4 boys at home to 4 hungry boys at home unsupervised. Mom was out probably visiting her mother, our Grandma Butterman, probably for the entire afternoon. And we knew that those visits could stretch for hours. And we didn't have instant communication in 1970. There were no text messaging, no, "Hey Mom, we're starving." There was no way to reach her. She was gone. And with her absence came an opportunity. Now let me be very clear about something. At 12 years old, I was not running criminal enterprises. It wasn't some pint-sized Tony Soprano plotting elaborate schemes. I was just a hungry kid who had street smarts, maybe too smart. The kind of smart that looks at a problem and doesn't see an obstacle. It sees a puzzle. The puzzle was this: we had nothing to eat. How can we fix that? I'm not talking about there's nothing good to eat. I'm talking about absolute nuclear level nothing. Mom and Dad were on a fixed budget. The refrigerator was a museum of vegetables, ketchup, and mustard. The cupboards were barren. The bread box, and yes, people still had bread boxes in 1970, was empty. We were 4 hungry preteen boys in an empty house, and the hunger was real. I gathered my brothers. I remember this moment vividly. I called them together with the kind of authority that an older brother has in the absence of authority. I said, "We're starving. We need food. We need a solution." And I had one. But here's where it gets interesting. I knew I couldn't do it alone. I needed an accomplice. Enter Jeff, stage door right. Jeff in 1970 was perfect for this role. He was young, still in the golden age of belief. He hadn't yet been damaged by my pranks and schemes that would litter the next several years like so much childhood debris. He was earnest. He was without guile. He was, in the most charming possible way, Patsy. I picked up our rotary phone, and if you're under 40, just pause for a second and Google a rotary phone. It's a physical object attached to a wall by a cord. You didn't dial numbers into it. You put your finger in a slot, twisted, and waited for it to rotate back. And then you repeated this mechanical ballet 9 more times to call someone. It was intimate. It was deliberate. And it was also perfect for what I was about to do. I pretended to dial Grandma Smith's house. Now, when I say pretended, you need to understand the full scope of what that means. I didn't actually call. Yes, I picked up the phone. I pressed the receiver to my ear, and I performed the act of calling. I twisted the dial with theatrical precision, and when I brought the phone to my mouth, I activated the greatest performance of my young life. My brothers watched. What they didn't see was me hanging up the call with my fingers. And what came next was Oscar worthy. I spoke to Grandma with the perfect mix of desperation and respect. I told her we were home alone, which was true. We were destitute, which was dramatically true. We were very, very hungry, which was aggressively true. Could she help us? Could she possibly spare some food? My brothers were listening and watching. They believed me, every word. Looking back, I realized I could have been an actor. I could have done Shakespeare in the park. I could have even run for office. I was that good of an actor. The level of commitment I had to that performance was pristine. Then I hung up the phone with perfect timing, nodding solemnly. "Okay, Grandma," my voice thick with gratitude, "we'll be right over. Thank you so very much." I hung up the rotary phone. Now, every great scheme needs a pigeon. And I don't mean that unkindly. A pigeon is just someone who hasn't yet learned that the world contains cleverness, duplicity, and an older brother with an empty stomach and full imagination. But here's the thing about being an effective mastermind at 12 years old. You can't just order someone around. You have to sell it. You have to make them want to be part of your plan. They have to feel like heroes, not pawns. They have to think they're saving the day. I looked at Jeff. "Jeff," I said with absolute sincerity, "Grandma has said she has food for us. Someone's got to go get it." I let that sink in. I think that someone should be you. Jeff's face, I wish I had a photograph of it, because at that moment he transformed from a hungry 10-year-old into the one who will rescue us. He became the hero of the story. He became the chosen one. Jeff nodded, and with that nod, the die was cast. He knew Grandma's house was about a mile away. Jeff left, and as I sat there with the twins, Rick and Randy, 8 years old, we waited. About 20 minutes. That's all it took. 20 minutes of me imagining what might happen. Would Grandma be home? Would the whole thing fall apart? Would Jeff come back empty-handed, and I'd have to confess to the entire ruse? And then the door opened, and Jeff stood there, holding a bag of groceries like it was the Holy Grail. He was breathless. He was excited. He was proud. Grandma wasn't home, but Aunt Gladys and Aunt Betty answered the door. And this is where the story takes a turn. Our aunts Gladys and Betty lived with my Grandma and Grandpa Smith in the 1970s. They were on a fixed income. They were not wealthy. They were managing. Every dollar counted. Every meal was budgeted. The week's groceries were planned with mathematical precision. And then Jeff shows up at the door, explaining that Grandma had been called and promised him food. Jeff explained the situation with perfect childhood honesty. Grandma said, "Come and get the food." And here's where my aunts made a decision I didn't anticipate. Now, they could have called our house. They could have asked questions. Instead, they looked at this 11-year-old boy at their door and said, "Well, we're down to our last loaf of bread, but if that's what Grandma wants to do, here you are." And they filled a bag for Jeff. Bread, jelly, other delicacies. The last of what they had. Not because they were gullible, but because a hungry kid showed up at their door. And they couldn't say no. They were decent people. And that's the part that haunts me now. Not in a bad way, really. Not with guilt or shame. But with the kind of recognition of what that moment meant. These two women on a fixed income giving away their last loaf of bread because they couldn't imagine turning a child away. Jeff came home and sat down with his provisions like a hunter returning from the wilderness. This is where I made a decision that either makes me a villain or a truth teller, depending on your perspective. Probably both. "Jeff," I said, "I never called Grandma." There was silence. "What?" "I never called her," I repeated. "I pretended. I faked the whole thing. I needed you to get us some food, so I made up a story." I watched his face process the information. Betrayal, confusion, anger. As a 12-year-old with an empty stomach and a full conscience, I felt absolutely nothing. No shame, no remorse. I had solved the problem. I had gotten food for my brothers. The mechanism of how we acquired it was morally irrelevant to me at that moment. I was a kid. I was hungry. But Jeff, he had been used. Good nature, his willingness to help, had been weaponized by his older brother for the acquisition of groceries. Looking back, it's dark, but also a little hilarious. I'm not sure Jeff ever told Mom. That part is lost to history. But it was a lesson, maybe the most important one Jeff would learn that year. The world contains clever people. Your trust can be exploited. And what separates the myth from the Smith is Jeff survived it. He grew from it. And eventually he can laugh about it, which hopefully Jeff has been doing for 55 years. As I look back, here's what's strange about childhood. You live in this bubble of absoluteness. Everything is right or wrong, good or bad, funny or not funny. Back then, we didn't have the cognitive equipment to understand nuance or consequences. What separates the Smith from the myth is that we move through a world with our appetite, our imagination, doing what makes sense in that moment. That was me in 1970. A year that sounds impossibly distant now. And again, separating the Smith from the myth, no one was harmed in this story. My aunts weren't traumatized. Jeff wasn't scarred, at least not physically. But mentally, spiritually, well, maybe there was some minor damage. The kind of damage that builds character. The kind of damage that teaches you something about the world. And that's what makes this Smith story worth telling 55 years later. Because that world in 1970 is gone. That world of rotary phones and unsupervised children and aunts who gave away their last loaf of bread, that world no longer exists. The world today is different. In some ways better, and in some ways not even close. Jeff has his own grandchildren now, and he tells them stories about his older brother and the time he was sent on a mission to get food, only to discover it was all an elaborate hoax. And I imagine they listen with the same delighted confusion. The twins, Rick and Randy, they also carry this story forward. It's become mythology now in our family. It's the kind of thing that gets referenced at podcasts and reunions and family gatherings. Kyle wasn't even born yet, but he knows this story. It's part of the family folklore. So here we are, separating the Smith from the myth. The myth is that this was some elaborate con, some masterpiece of childhood manipulation. The truth is simpler. A hungry kid got a brilliant idea that worked perfectly, with this combination of luck and timing. A little brother trusted his older brother and got pranked for his trouble. Family got a Smith story that lasted more than half a century. Sometimes the best memories are the ones that hurt a little when you're living them. and then make you smile forever after. My name is Brian Smith, separating the Smith from the myth.